Jesus said, you call me Lord, but yet you don't do what I tell you to do. We call ourselves Christians, and so often we do not do what the Lord would have us to do. Jesus told a story about two men that were building a house. One fellow went out and he looked around. It was on the beach and he saw a beautiful place. There was trees growing and the wind was blowing through the trees. It was a beautiful place. And he had lots of money. So he decided to buy that beachfront property and build a house right on the beach, right on the sand. There was another fellow that was walking down the beach, and he couldn't afford oceanfront property. But he looked up on the side of the bank, almost to the top of the hill, and there was a lot for sale there. And he looked and he could see the rocks. There was lots of rocks, and he thought, I can get that for a good price, and I'll build a house there. Well, the fellow who bought the property on the beach built his house. It was a big house. It had lots of windows. You could see in any direction. It was a beautiful, big house built on the beach, built on the sand. The other man built a small house up against the bank, and he couldn't see everywhere, but he had windows where he could see in one direction, and he built a house there. They both finished their house. They were built, and they were ready to move in. Well, they were listening on the radio, and they heard that there was a storm coming. And the storm, they named storms back then. And the name of the storm was Carmela. So they went and they went to the local hardware and they were buying plywood to put on the windows. And they were there and they began a conversation and they became friends. And they agreed to help each other. They agreed to help each other prepare their house for the coming storm, Carmela. Well, the next day the storm came, and it was brutal. It was mean. It blew everything away. All the people's lives were in tatters along that coast. Everyone was just out of everything. The whole town gathered at the beach where the man built the big house. It had floated down the ocean. And they all gathered and they looked up. They looked up on the side of the hill, and the man who built his house on the side of the hill, it was still standing. Because his house was built on a firm foundation. Whereas the rich man that built it on the beach, his house was built on sand. And when the storm came, it just washed everything away. Foundations are very important. Foundation of the church is very important. Foundation of your family is very important. Foundation for me as a preacher, my foundation is very important. Years ago, many years ago, my dad, I must have been about 20, and I was out at his house early in the morning. And he said, "Do you want to go to the chuck wagon to drink coffee?" I said, "I'll go, but I can't stand coffee. I'll drink something else. I'll go, but I can't stand coffee." And got there, it was years ago, and they were in the corner, and there was 4 or 5 other men there, and they were all drinking coffee, and I sat down, and the waitress brought me coffee before I even asked. I was going to get a soft drink or something. But she brought coffee, and I began to drink it. And I listened to those men talk. They talked about everything in the world. I mean, they talked about Christianity, they talked about religion, they talked about politics, they talked about everything in the world. And they told stories. And I sat there and I listened to that. This was when I was working in a factory. I hadn't received my call to preach the gospel. But I took all that in, how they told stories to illustrate a significant point they were trying to make. That was the beginning of me drinking coffee. That was the beginning of me listening to stories and thinking in the future how I would use stories to get my point across. And I thought about it, this is what Jesus did. He told stories to get his point across. Foundation. Foundation in a family is very important. Foundation in the church is important. Foundation for a preacher is important. If you ever have the chance, and I'm going to make about 10 churches in this area mad right here. I'm going to make it mad right here. But I can't help it, it's the truth. If you ever get the chance, go out to Green Valley and go into the Greenview Church. And stand up there at the pulpit and look at the windows around that church. They are the most beautiful windows I've ever seen. Plus, they tell the story from the birth of Jesus all through his life. They tell a story. Each window tells a story from the birth to the ascension till he ascended to God. And while I was out there one Sunday morning, I was saying the benediction, and I looked at those windows, and it hit me. It hit me. It didn't hit me. Maybe he hit me. To preach a sermon on every one of those windows. Sort of a revival. And preach them consecutively, each and every night. And I made that announcement, and 3 people said, that will never work. Because that's been tried before. That will never work. But I was led to do it, and I preached 15 straight nights on those windows. And I was young and inexperienced. I didn't know what in the world I was going to do. I would have to do a sermon for 15 straight days. And you know what happened? I trust the Lord. I trusted him. And he brought me through that. And you know, for 15 days, 15 straight days, it didn't rain a drop. It was beautiful. It was in the fall. And for 15 straight days, the least people we got at one of those services was 50. 50. I can't get 50 in 3 services now. 50. And at the end of the very last night, everybody in that church came forth and rededicated their life, shored up their foundation with Jesus. Those days, I hope, are not over. But I'll tell you one thing for sure. I'll tell you this for sure. The storms are coming. The storms are coming. They are coming. And are we prepared? What is our foundation? You can't rely on your wealth. You cannot rely on that because it'll sweep that away. You can't rely on your name. Well, I'm such and such. Everybody knows me. when I go into a place or a room, people know who I am. Everybody knows who I am. You cannot rely on your reputation because that will be swept away. The only thing you can rely on is Jesus Christ. That's it. Nothing else. Nothing. There is nothing else that you can rely on that will keep you and love you and bless you this day.